Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service Al Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of Al Monitor, and this week we are talking with Vivian Salama, national security reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Vivian has reported from over 70 countries, including Egypt, Yemen, Pakistan, Israel and the Palestinian territories, the United Arab Emirates, and Iraq, where she was bureau chief for the Associated Press. Her experience covering the refugee crisis in the region inspired her to write a children's book called The Long Journey Home, about an innocent Syrian boy who was forced to flee his home because of the war there. Vivian has a law degree from Georgetown University, a master's from Columbia in Islamic politics, and speaks fluent Arabic. Since moving to Washington in 2016, Vivian has covered the White House and national politics for the Wall Street Journal, NBC News, and the Associated Press, with a focus on foreign policy. Vivian will preview what we can expect from the Biden administration on the Middle East at the UN General Assembly and beyond, including the impact, if any, on the U.S. rift with France, on regional diplomacy, if the Iran nuclear deal still has a pulse, and whether the conflicts in Yemen, Syria, and Libya are any closer to resolution. My conversation with Vivian Salama begins now. Vivian, welcome to On the Middle East.
So great to be with you.
Great to have you. Before we get into some of the specific Middle East issues this week, let's set the scene for this year's General Assembly, which kicks off this week. COVID is top of the agenda, and approximately 100 or so world leaders, including President Biden, are speaking live at the UN. Many are participating virtually. The Biden administration comes into the General Assembly following the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the return of the Taliban, and as well as a major diplomatic snafu with the French over the Australia submarine deal, all of which may be giving some allies and partners some pause about U.S. commitments. So big picture, what are the Biden administration's goals and expectations this week? Biden will speak tomorrow, Tuesday, and return to Washington soon after, but a scaled-down delegation led by Secretary Blinken will remain. What's on the agenda?
Well, President Biden is going to be addressing his first UN General Assembly since he's become president. And it's worth noting that the world is a very different place now than it was when he was vice president. A lot has changed. And so, not least of which, we're sort of in the middle of this ongoing global pandemic, which we thought a couple of months ago seemed to be sort of on the mend. And then we hit a spike again with the Delta variant. And so President Biden definitely going to prioritize that as far as finding global solutions to combating the COVID-19 virus pandemic and the variants of it, especially a vaccine effort to get developing countries vaccinated and whatnot. But of course, that comes with the backdrop of trying to get people in the United States vaccinated too. And so he's going to be taking on like a very careful dance and trying to promote vaccinations while also emphasizing U.S. interests with regard to vaccines and booster shots and such. And so that's going to be one of his top priorities. But sort of more broadly, from a geopolitical standpoint, President Biden came to office really trying to tout this image of pro-multilateralism, trying to strengthen alliances, trying to really contrast what his administration planned to do from his predecessor, former President Donald Trump, who ruffled feathers with some allies and had tense relations even with some of the most steadfast allies in Europe, especially. And it's been interesting because we're now about 9 months into this administration's time in office, or 8 months, into the administration's time in office. And a lot of those relationships haven't really turned around in the way that I think a lot of people were expecting. Tensions with China are growing by the day, and the Biden administration has not only supported some of the tough stances that the Trump administration took on China, but has actually doubled down and added to it crackdowns on their human rights record and things like that, which the Trump administration didn't quite do as much. And so you have that growing tension that has become a global concern shared with allies. But the approach to China has been different between the US and its allies, especially some in Europe. And that has caused some issues, including, as you mentioned, this diplomatic row with France, which we can get to in a moment. But China, confronting China is at the heart of that as well. So you have that issue. You have the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, which took place just last month, where NATO allies felt that they were sort of left on a lurch when the US decided to withdraw from Afghanistan. They really had no choice but to withdraw as well. And the nature of the US withdrawal with regard to getting support staff, Afghan support staff that helped the US and its allies over the course of this 20-year war, how they were going to evacuate them vis-a-vis the very rapid takeover by the Taliban, that just created a really difficult situation for all these countries. And so there was a lot of anger and resentment, A, about how it was done, but also B, what happens to Afghanistan now from a counterterrorism perspective. And so that's going to be something not only that President Biden is definitely going to address in his speech on Tuesday, but also behind the scenes in these bilateral meetings with certain leaders that he's meeting, as well as with the UN Secretary General on Monday. Those conversations are definitely going to come up because now you have a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, as well as a security crisis that a lot of people are concerned, a lot of countries are concerned about. And then finally, just in terms of economic cooperation and trying to get the world sort of back on its feet post-pandemic and things like that, trade, cyber cooperation, a lot of those issues also ultimately going to come up as well. And so those are probably the main themes that we're going to be seeing as we go into this important week where President Biden is taking the stage at the UN for the first time.
Vivian, how does the diplomatic row with France affect U.S. initiatives in the Middle East, if it does at all? French President Emmanuel Macron has been active in the Middle East, especially in Lebanon, and he participated in the regional summit in Iraq in August as well.
So this is going to be really interesting to watch moving forward. And for folks who aren't following it so closely, last week, the US and the UK announced a joint initiative whereby they would get into a deal with Australia to provide them with nuclear-powered submarines, which the US refused to say was an effort to sort of police the Asian waters with the growing threats posed by China. It was a strategic move by both the US and the UK, but that's ultimately, reading between the lines, what this deal had intended to do. The French immediately firing back at the US, very angry by this deal. They said that the Australians had gotten into a deal with them for conventional submarines and then canceled the deal in order to get into this deal with the US and the UK. And immediately following that, the French announced that they were recalling their ambassador to the US for consultation on the matter. And that's a really unprecedented move by France to do to the US, signaling how upset they were. But interestingly, that this comes, with a lot of questions. The Middle East is a place where the US and France cooperate on a number of military initiatives. I remember years back when I was based in the United Arab Emirates, and the French and the US used to conduct joint military exercises to train the UAE military. And that's something that we see across the region. The French have a very apt Air Force, and the US used to really rely heavily on them for a lot of those training exercises and whatnot. They're also very good at, they produce a lot of very high-tech jets and other military equipment. And so they are a leading contender for military equipment in the world, but ultimately a lot of countries tend to side with the US on these areas because the US is probably unrivaled in terms of its own technologies. And so it's going to be interesting to see moving forward, because there is a lot of military cooperation between the US and France, not just from the business perspective, but the military and intelligence perspective in the Middle East, especially. Both countries obviously having a lot of interest in the Middle East. And so whether or not it's impacted or not remains to be seen. Now, sources I've been speaking to indicate that this is probably just going to last a couple of days. The French are angry, but ultimately they know that the alliance is way too important to burn the bridge with the US, given how many initiatives they have together all over the world. But, just the fact that they would even recall their ambassador signifies a level of anger that we really haven't seen. And a lot of it, mind you, just a final point, a lot of that is speaks to President Macron of France's personality too. He's increasingly wanting to assert France as sort of this leader in the world, definitely a leader in Europe, but even a leader in the world. And he has taken an interesting tact with both Presidents Trump and Biden in terms of kind of this bromance that you used to see with a lot of touching and hugging and sort of affection and smiles at the beginning. But then he tends to take a very tough line with them once they sort of go off course with them. With President Trump, it was over Iran. And now we see this incident with President Biden. And so that relationship is going to be interesting to watch too, especially since President Macron also has a lot of interests in the Middle East and North Africa, especially. And so whether or not he gets the Biden administration to kind of play ball with him on those issues, we'll see how that unfolds.
Let's stay on COVID for a minute. According to Johns Hopkins University, only about 14 to 15% of the people in the world are fully vaccinated against COVID-19. In advanced economies, the number is over 40%. And in low-income countries, it's actually hovering around 2%. If your population's not vaccinated, your economies are unlikely to turn around. Perhaps not surprisingly, in the Middle East, the countries with the lowest vaccination rates are Egypt, Iraq, Oman, Iran, and Tunisia. There are also no good statistics on Libya. The West Bank and Gaza obviously are lagging, while the Gulf and Israel have fared better. What do you expect this week's and beyond for those countries in the Middle East struggling with COVID? And how do you see COVID impacting the trajectory of the Middle East and North Africa economic situation?
The Biden administration faces this double-edged sword of wanting to promote its vaccine programs, get people vaccinated around the world, because obviously with travel and, just business endeavors and whatnot, it's going to be more helpful to have a safer world out there. And also promoting its own vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, and other US companies, to have those vaccines dispersed around the world versus alternatives like the Russian vaccine or the Chinese vaccine. There is a bit of vaccine diplomacy going on, and it's something that's a very touchy subject when you talk to the White House about it, because they're very keen on getting U.S. vaccines in the arms of people around the world, but they don't actually want to say it that way because it makes it sound too much like a business endeavor. But then you have the situation back in the U.S. where, the U.S. is struggling to get people in certain states, especially vaccinated. Obviously, it's become a very political issue in the United States. And so booster shots, the Biden administration kind of hoping that they can keep the booster shots domestic for the time being, until they really get enough of the population in the US vaccinated in order to start kind of promoting it and sending them abroad. All of this is to say that it's caused a lot of slowdowns in terms of travel, in terms of business, and just moving of goods and people and everything. Everything kind of came to a screeching halt for a little while there last year. And while it's picked up, it's nowhere near some of the levels that we have seen. The U.S. is now wanting to open its borders once again to European travelers and trying to kind of get that back and going. But for a year and a half now, we've closed our borders to the Canadians, to the Mexicans, to all of our neighbors and closest allies. And that goes for the Middle East too. And that obviously creates a lot of problems. And then you have developing world, which is completely on a different level than the developed world. As you said, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, those countries that already had enough problems before COVID with regard to being able to support its population, its economies, and just feeding people in some cases, problems with violence, problems with civil unrest and things like that. These are all various aspects that can really concern the governments in these parts of the world. I mean, so much of what we saw, for example, in the Arab Spring, I mean, we used to call it the bread protests, because people were literally, fighting for respect, but also for just to be able to have a decent standard of living in Egypt and in Tunisia and these countries, and so they took to the streets because of that, and the pandemic essentially exacerbates any progress that was made since then. What little progress in some of these countries was made since then, and so there's a lot of concern that this could really take a number of countries back. It is definitely, countries like Afghanistan, kind of more broadly than the Middle East, but Yemen also, countries that were just in the worst of conditions before the pandemic. And now you sprinkle on a global pandemic where the healthcare system comes under strain, the economy comes under strain, travel is limited. It's a really dire situation in a large part of the Middle East, especially since we're talking about the Middle East. And so the Biden administration certainly looking for solutions to that. They've provided vaccines to a number of these countries, trying to help alleviate the situation. But you're dealing with countries like Egypt and Iraq, Iran, where the populations are enormous, and it's really just not enough to really combat what these countries are having to deal with. And so it's an ongoing crisis that doesn't seem to be getting any better, and especially now that we're talking about a very aggressive variant of the virus. The story continues and will continue for a while now.
Vivian, the Biden administration came to office with two priorities in the Middle East, Iran and Yemen. And let's start with Iran. There was a dash to make the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, or Iran nuclear deal, which the Trump administration withdrew from in May 2018. There was an effort to make that deal whole again by this summer, while Iranian President Hassan Rouhani was still in power. So much for that. We now have a new, more hardline president in Iran, Ibrahim Raisi. What can we expect with regard to the Iran nuclear talks, not just this week, but also in coming months? Do you think a deal is in the works or possible, or has that ship sailed?
I don't want to say it's sailed, but the motor of that ship is definitely running and ready to leave the dock soon. The Biden administration has been growing increasingly frustrated with Iran's failure to comply with levels of uranium enrichment and just its defiance of the old JCPOA agreement. Obviously, they point to their predecessor, the Trump administration, for having exited the deal and so exacerbated the situation, created this the incentive for Iran to sort of violate and fail to comply. But at the end of the day, Iran, in their mind, is nowhere near the levels that it should be for them to even seriously engage. And despite the fact that there was an agreement set by the IAEA last week where that seemed to kind of signal that Iran was going to come back in to cooperate, basically come back to the table a little bit more. The Biden administration privately is sort of shaking their heads and saying that they're not optimistic about it. Now, we do have talks continuing with the U.S. envoy Rob Malley. Sorry, President Trump used to call him O'Malley, and so I would repeat that sometimes. Sorry, Rob Malley is going to be taking the lead and on those talks, as he has been, and trying to find a solution to this crisis, this problem of getting Iran on board. But at the end of the day, they are so far away from being anywhere near where the Biden administration what the Biden administration would consider a reasonable level to start engaging in serious discussions that privately they're not optimistic about it happening anytime soon. And so then the question becomes, what do you do next? Do you just sort of leave this whole situation hanging, or do you start taking punitive action? And there is a sense in Washington that some punitive measures may begin to start rolling out toward the end of this year or early next year if we don't see drastic changes on the side of the Iranians. And what I mean is sanctions, essentially. And so it's not an ideal situation. The Biden administration obviously wanting to get some sort of a deal and seeing Iran come back to the levels that they were at maybe in 2016, although they'd love to see it even better than that. But they just feel like the situation has gone so, so off the rails with Iran that it's going to be hard, and it's not going to be something that is going to turn around or kind of magically happen in the first or even second year in office. The other issue is that President Biden is not President Obama in terms of just this sense of embracing JCPOA in its former form. President Obama was very keen on it. Whereas President Biden, and we've seen this with Afghanistan, we've seen this with a lot of other countries, Cuba as well, he tends to be a little bit more skeptical about some of these authoritarian regimes, and is very wary about engaging with them and getting into agreements with them. And that is the case with Iran as well. And so President Biden ultimately not as much in a rush to get a deal as perhaps his predecessor, who used to talk about deals all the time. And that was sort of his vernacular for kind of getting agreements with foreign countries. It's let's get a deal. President Biden is not one to rush into a deal just for the sake of a deal. In fact, he's kind of slow to it because of the fact that he's not completely on board with the idea of having a quote unquote deal with Iran. He'd like to see Iran in compliance and scaling down its nuclear program and stopping uranium enrichment, whatnot. But he doesn't necessarily want to be engaging with the Iranians. And so this is like the other distinguishing factor that will be really interesting to see how it plays out, is sort of whether or not there's that incentive by the Biden White House to really get this over the finish line in a anytime soon. And as long as the Iranians are dragging their feet, it's not going to happen.
With regard to the meetings this week, the new Iranian Foreign Minister, Hossein Amir Abdollahian, will be attending the sessions. Do you think there will be any diplomacy around his appearance? And you mentioned, President Trump was eager to get a deal. And 2 years ago, when the last UNGA was held in person prior to the COVID pandemic, there was a real flurry when President Macron tried to arrange or broker a meeting between Trump and then Iranian President Rouhani that didn't happen. Do you see any sense of diplomatic flurry in the coming week with the foreign minister, the new Iranian foreign minister in town?
Oh my God, Andrew, you brought back some memories. I was the pool reporter with President Trump because I was a White House reporter at the time during the UNGA in 2019. And when we started hearing from sources that there was a potential that President Macron was going to broker this meeting at the Trump Tower in New York with President Rouhani, we were running around like chickens with our heads cut off in the streets because it was so huge. And the symbolism of it, everything about it would have been enormous. But then again, President Trump also met with Kim Jong-un. And so anything was possible at that time. That's not going to happen with President Biden. Let's be very clear that President Biden, when it comes to that kind of thing, he is not going to hold a meeting with the new Iranian president. It's just not going to happen. But you can bet that there's definitely, we know Mali's talking to the administration, the Iranian regime, trying to get a deal in the works, or at least kind of jumpstart the talks that are dragging at this point. There's definitely diplomacy happening behind the scene, and that's probably another big difference that with the Biden administration and the Obama administration, and something probably that the Trump administration gets credit for, is that they are much more upfront about talks with countries that are not allies, that don't have diplomatic relations with the US, they're much more willing to kind of be honest about back channel discussions. They've been talking about similar back channel discussions with the North Koreans in terms of trying to get talks underway and things like that. And so in the old days, you wouldn't even acknowledge something like that until you had something more concrete. And now the administration is very open to say, yes, we are talking to them, we're trying. I'm sure there are going to be discussions behind the scenes at UNGA by US and Iranian officials in an attempt to see if we can kind of get things moving in the right direction. But any leader-to-leader meetings, forget about it. Like, it's not going to happen. President Biden won't do it.
Vivian, let's turn to Yemen. And I'm going to preface this question by noting that 8 years ago, you wrote a piece on Yemen for Al Monitor. So we are proud to call you a former contributor. The Biden administration removed some of the terrorist designations on the Iran-backed Houthi forces back in January or February, very early in the administration. But the Houthis have shown no interest in any reciprocal goodwill, at least to this point. The U.S. has also appointed an envoy for Yemen, Timothy Lenderking. A UN Human Rights Council report this month described, however, a continued, quote, climate of fear over the past year in Yemen, including airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition that supports the Yemeni government, and, I'm quoting again, indiscriminate shelling of civilians, particularly by the Houthis, but also by the government of Yemen and the coalition. This is a major humanitarian disaster, tragedy for the world. Any chance of action here, and how do you see the prospects for resolution of the Yemen conflict in the coming months?
I have to tell you, the Yemenis have never caught a break. Talking about indiscriminate shellings and humanitarian crisis. I mean, for as long as I've covered Yemen, that seems to be a theme. It just depends on who's doing the shelling and, what is kind of exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. That part is shifted over the years. But Yemen is a disaster. And unfortunately, it's one that doesn't get a lot of coverage. Al Monitor, you all have been wonderful at covering it, but a lot of the mainstream US media, unfortunately, doesn't have it on its radar. And so the situation gets worse by the day. What was more is that the Saudi government in the days of the Trump administration was sort of given carte blanche on a lot of issues. At one point, the Trump administration finally had to intervene and say, okay, guys, can you take it easy on Yemen? Because the situation just appeared to be so horrible and deteriorating by the minute. But for the most part, the Saudis were able to engage in this relentless military assault on Yemen, which the Saudis insist is a measure of national security. They say the Houthis keep on attacking Saudi Arabia, and so this is a necessary action for them to protect their country. Also, keep in mind that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman used to be in charge of national security matters in the country, and so he's also been a very, very heavy-handed when it comes to the Yemen situation. And so that's sort of the background information, kind of context going into where we are now. The Biden administration, President Biden himself, kind of was very committed to finding a solution to the Yemen crisis. He used to talk about it a lot with his transition team. I was getting, constant messages from folks on his team who knew that I covered Yemen. They were saying, this is something that's going to be a priority for him when he comes into office. And so, like you said, he assigned an envoy rather quickly into his time in office. And Tim Lenderking is someone who had a lot of rapport with the Saudis in particular. And so that was seen as a huge bit of leverage, especially since the Biden administration sort of had estranged relations with the Saudis over its human rights record, over the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. They wanted Tim to kind of go in there and ease tensions with the Saudis sort of behind the scenes and try to find a solution to the Yemen crisis. But in the meantime, the Houthis have been reluctant, or maybe reluctant's not the word, but defiant is probably the better word. The Houthis have not shown any desire to really settle any of these matters and find a peace deal, or even engage in a potential talks that would lead to a peace deal. And so there's been growing frustration with the Biden administration, the State Department. I mean, there's been growing frustration by the Biden administration with the Houthis. And the Biden Ned Price, the spokesman for the State Department, came out a couple of weeks ago to the mic and said that they were pretty fed up with the Houthis, and the situation has just gotten worse by the day. And so finding a solution for the Biden administration, while still a very important matter and something that's talked about, we haven't really seen any breakthroughs yet in their time in office. So, and whether or not the Houthis and the Saudis are willing to kind of engage, that remains to be seen. The Saudis say publicly and privately that they want a solution, but the airstrikes continue. And so it's everybody kind of coming in with their own perspective and their own side to this conflict. But in the meantime, a lot of civilians are suffering because they're either caught in the crossfire or victims of the humanitarian crisis that continues to ravage the country.
One of the interesting developments on Yemen has been the Iraq-mediated talks between Iranian and Saudi officials in Baghdad, and these conversations have been about Yemen. Do you see prospects for progress there in these talks, direct talks between Iran and Saudi?
The Iranians and the Saudis have a very complicated relationship now. So the Iranians are involved because the Houthis are viewed as an Iranian proxy, as well as other fringe groups in Yemen. And so the Trump administration used to constantly hammer the Houthis and accuse Iran of basically waging a war against Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis the Houthis. And so that is why the Iranians are involved in these talks. But the Saudis and the Iranians obviously have a very complicated relationship that dates back, to times long before you and I were around, and even before that. I mean, it's almost ancient at this point. And so maybe I'm skeptical because I've spent a lot of time in that part of the world. I don't see the Iranians and the Saudis shaking hands on pretty much anything anytime soon, but maybe they'll surprise me. For now, just the fact that they are meeting is significant. Obviously, everybody wants a solution to the conflict, because any disruptions in that part of the world, they can impact trade and the Gulf waters and a number of other factors, which all these countries have an interest in, obviously. And so nobody wants to see this conflict escalate. But at the same time, all of these countries also have, Iran and Saudi in particular, have their own domestic interests at heart when it comes to this, to the Yemen conflict. And so I hope for the best, but if you'll forgive me for not being completely optimistic about it, because I've just these two countries have a lot of differences that are so much more deeply rooted than the Yemen alone, and so it's hard to envision anything really turning this around.
Let's turn to Syria. UN Humanitarian Affairs Chief Martin Griffiths last week said that Syria, after more than a decade of war, remains caught in a downward spiral, and that the country will continue to be a place of tragedy so long as the conflict continues. Now, any political solution in Syria also involves Iran, just like as in Yemen, but also Russia. So what can we expect, if anything, regarding the process towards a political solution over the war in Syria? And if you could place it in the context of U.S.-Russian relations, do you see any traction there?
So obviously the Russians are deeply rooted in Syria, and any resolution that is to come from the Syria conflict has to involve the Russians. But the U.S. has also been heavily involved because, obviously, of its support to U.S.-backed forces in the north and whatnot. So the Russians and the U.S. are going to have to talk. They started their discussions in Geneva earlier this year. The deconfliction channels for the military still exist in terms of airstrikes and any kind of military operations that are going on there. So there is contact, but ultimately trying to find a solution to the conflict is going to have all of these countries coming to the table in the way that we've seen with so many other conflicts. And by the way, this is the case also in Libya as well, where you have the Russians supporting one side and the U.S. the U.S. is hovering on Libya, so I'm not going to really make that comparison. But there are a lot of interests at stake, is the point that I'm trying to make. And so Syria definitely, at some point, the U.S. is going to have to sit with the Russians and try to find a solution, if not from the humanitarian perspective, then also from the security perspective. The U.S. doesn't want to do any nation building. They don't want to kind of say Assad is the rightful leader or he's not the rightful leader. They kind of defer to the people of Syria for that decision. But we're now 10 years into this conflict, and absent any drastic changes, there's going to have to be some sort of a settlement at some point, which perhaps the Biden administration will take the lead on. And so it remains to be seen, but that's sort of at the heart why President Biden met with President Putin in Geneva in June. It's not just because of some of the election meddling and because of cyber attacks and other issues like that, but also a lot of strategic cooperation issues, counterterrorism issues, and that goes for Afghanistan too. We work, I don't want to say with the Russians, but in conjunction with the Russians on a number of different issues, and Syria being kind of at the forefront of that. And so these countries are going to have to cooperate with each other, whether they like it or not.
Vivian, we're running out of time. You teased my last question, which deals with Libya. And this is perhaps some relatively good news compared to some of the other accounts and conflicts we've been talking about. The UN last year had a diplomatic breakthrough, really, by bringing together the warring parties on a unity government with a timetable to hold elections in December of this year. That's coming up fast. We had Stephanie Williams on the show a few weeks ago. She brokered the deal as acting UN envoy. How do you see the process playing out in Libya? And do you think elections are going to be held and this fragile coalition government can hold together?
The sense is that the Libyans have come to the point where they recognize that the situation is only set to get worse absent elections and some sort of political solution. And so, the elections obviously represent this opportunity for stability and unity in the country. And the warring factions do recognize that to a certain degree, but it comes, as you say, at a time where things are very fragile. There are a number of countries, almost too many to list, that have that support opposing factions in the country. And that's always a recipe for disaster, the Middle East being sort of guinea pig for international intervention from different countries, which ultimately kind of leads to disaster. Libya is no different. And so you have the Egyptians who support General Haftar. And you have the Russians who are supporting one side, and you have the Qataris who are supporting one side. And so there are too many to list, not to mention the Europeans who feel that Libya is on their doorstep and they support the UN-backed government in Tripoli. And it's been a long-standing conflict that has only gotten worse over the years since President Gaddafi was overthrown and killed about a decade ago. And so now you have these elections, and obviously the ceasefire that came about last year, potentially paving the way for some sort of political solution. And the Biden administration, interestingly, has decided to take a back seat, as did the Trump administration to a degree. I did a lot of stories during the Trump years about National Security Advisor John Bolton, who had tried to at least get President Trump to engage with General Haftar to see if there was a way that they could show him at least some support, enough that all parties would be engaged in the conflict in Libya, and that way they'd find a political solution. But President Trump really had no real interest in that, and it fizzled when John Bolton was fired from his position. And so we sort of went into limbo with regard to U.S. support for Libya. the Biden administration has been very supportive of talks, reconciliation talks, and talks to get these elections underway, but choosing sides has not really been their forte. And so it's interesting to see. I think the Biden administration kind of continuing the view from the years of the Obama administration during the Arab Spring, where they decided that picking sides in the Middle East potentially leads you to disaster, because you could pick the side of a leader that's overthrown the next day, and then you're seen as opposing the new leaders, and they don't really want to get involved in that kind of politics. And so they've been supporting talks, they've been supporting elections, but not supporting any particular sides. And so that's sort of the U.S. position. Whether the Libyans kind of can carry this through, get it over the finish line, get elections, and keep the peace after the elections, which is always key. It's looking good so far, albeit with everybody holding their breath. And so, we hope that these elections signify a new era for Libya, which has for now a decade just been completely unraveling by the day. There's also one interesting note that I can close with. I'd done a story with my colleague in the Middle East last week about General Haftar hiring lobbyists here in Washington and prominent lobbyists too, including Lanny Davis, who represented President Clinton during the impeachment inquiry when he was president. General Haftar has been hiring lobbyists, essentially trying to improve his image in Washington with the Biden administration in particular ahead of the elections, because he wants the administration to see him as something other than a warlord and perhaps a viable player in Libyan politics. And so he's been working hard behind the scenes with a $1 million contract to try to get that going as well. So we'll see if he's successful in that. But ultimately, this boils down to a positive and hopefully game-changing event for Libya in the coming months.
Vivian, thank you for joining us today. Your columns are required reading. I always learn from your reporting and analysis, and we look forward to having you back soon on the Middle East.
It's my pleasure.
We will return after this break.
Hello, I'm Gilles Kepel, professor at Sciences Po and Normal Sup in Paris, and author of a number of books and articles on the Middle East. The Middle East remains one of the most vital and fascinating regions in the world. It is rich in complexity and ideas, but for many in the West, it remains a puzzle with many missing pieces. Through my new podcast, Reading the Middle East, on the award-winning media service El Monitor, we will take a deep dive into the trends in the region with the authors and thought leaders who are shaping how we think about the Middle East. To begin my podcast, I speak with my friend and one of the most renowned novelists of the region, Egyptian writer Ala El-Aswani, about his latest book, The Republic of False Truths, that chronicles the run-up to Egypt's 2011 revolution and its aftermath. Reading the Middle East will be a fantastic addition to El Monitor's outstanding podcast lineup, including On the Middle East with Andrew Paraziliti and Amberin Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspit. You can subscribe to all three El Monitor podcasts on your favorite listening platforms. We look forward to your joining our conversation.
Thanks to our guest, Vivian Salama of the Wall Street Journal, our production team of Phil Calabro of El Monitor and Beowulf Rochland of Two Squared Media Productions, and thanks to all of you for listening. A reminder to look out next week for our newest podcast, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Kepel. You can sign up for all of our podcasts, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Kepel, as well as On Israel with Ben Caspit and On the Middle East, hosted by Amberin Zaman and me, at your favorite podcast platform.